Good afternoon, and thank you for joining Women at Ardent today for our webinar, The Road to Change, Understanding Change Management. Hi, I'm Dr. Rachel Frieja, your Corporate Director for Clinical Education. Before we begin, I'd like to review a couple of housekeeping notes. As you know, if you've previously attended a Women at Ardent webinar, all lines are muted, but we encourage you to interact with our speakers and each other using the chat function. At the conclusion of the presentation, we will answer your questions. If you are new to our webinars, we welcome you and we are glad you are here today. At the conclusion of the webinar, please complete our post-session survey as it helps us plan future webinars. We will post the link in the chat as well as put up a QR code. I'd like to start off by reaffirming our purpose of Women at Ardent: to network with and learn practical solutions from one another, sharing industry knowledge and leadership experience. The goal is to support all women in our organization to overcome gender barriers and prepare themselves for leadership opportunities. We believe that having a more diverse leaders makes our company stronger. Our Connect to Purpose today recognizes a woman who has been a trailblazer for change in our organization. Lori Bingham accepted the first Chief Nursing Officer position at Ardent, giving nurses a seat at the corporate executive level. She has tirelessly worked to support and advocate changes for all nurses within Ardent. She advocated for Kronos Dimensions, giving nurses mobile access to self-scheduling and timekeeping, deployed Rover mobile devices, allowing nurses to send patient care site photos to Epic and scan medications from the point of care. She made Lippincott online clinical tools available to all nurses at the bedside to improve patient care, negotiated tuition discounts with online universities to increase the number of BSN and MSN levels of nurses at our facilities, and made ANCC certification available at no cost to nurses and developed the foundation for the clinical ladder, allowing nurses to remain at the bedside while benefiting from their expertise. Lori is retiring at the end of the year, but will continue to foster change at Ardent, serving as the clinical executive sponsor of the Kronos Dimensions implementation and continuing her work on the Labor Committee for Productivity Standardization. Lori embodies the quote, "Be the change you want to see," and we are so grateful she has been a change agent at Ardent. For today's session, we will be learning about models of change management, as well as common issues and concerns related to this. Our speakers will cover how women can excel in times of change and how to be an ally of change. Our speakers today are Chelsea Barth, HR Director, Hillcrest Shared Services, and Kaitlin Snider, Vice President and Marketing Communications at Hillcrest. Thank you for joining us today, ladies, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rachel, for that introduction. And as we mentioned, and in the title of our slide here, we're going to take you on the road to change, and we're going to provide some framework around understanding change management. So as Chelsea and I set out to prepare for this presentation, it was easy for us to reflect on the last 20 months and to think about the ways in which businesses have had to change and adapt as it relates to the COVID pandemic. But even before the pandemic forced businesses to undergo changes, some of which they may not have wanted to, we understood that disruptions were a fact of business life. You know, there's the quote that the only constant in life is change, and we know this to be true. Businesses can't survive over the long term if they're not willing to reinvent themselves. And we see this being even more true in a post-COVID or business environment where organizational changes have almost become the rule as we try to cope with a new, more complex, more competitive and challenging market. So therefore, the need for change management expertise is even more important. So today, we're going to lay the groundwork for change management and the ways in which you can apply practical ways and processes to your own organizational changes, no matter how big or how small they may be. So when we look at the full journey that we're going to take you on today, we have to understand what change really is. And in a business setting, we understand change to be a project, an initiative, or a solution introduced in the workplace that is intended to improve something. So I think most of us can kind of look around and think of the various ways in which we've seen changes carry out over the last couple of months. Changes could be things as simple as implementation of a new technology, new software. It could be bigger things like changes in leadership, structural changes, or potentially mergers or acquisitions or other partnerships that will change the way you do business. Change management is applying a structured process and using a set of tools for leading the people side of change in order to achieve a desired outcome. So the purpose of every organizational change management initiative is really to successfully implement strategies and methods for affecting change in an organization and helping people accept and adapt to those changes. It's been referenced in statistics and data that there's about 50 to 70% chance that organizational change management initiatives will fail, or they'll fail to reach their desired outcome. And what this really highlights is why knowing how to coordinate and carry out change is a valuable skill for both leaders and managers alike. The good news is that change management can be successful if key principles are followed. And what we'll talk about today are really the 3 typical phases you will see in most change management models. That includes preparation, implementation, and then reinforcement. So before we dive into some of these key phases and really understanding what is behind change management, let's consider how people react to change. So we'd like to hear from you. We're going to ask you to pull out your phone or your personal device and open your internet browser and type in menti.com. And when you're there, if you'll enter the code that's on the screen, we want you to answer this question: how do you see others react to change? It might take us a minute to start to see results here.
Resistance, yep. Not surprising, yep. Reluctance.
Yeah.
Hesitation, emotional, all great answers.
Panic. Mm-hmm.
Fear, afraid, against.
Mm-hmm.
A lot
This
of
is how we've always done it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very visceral reactions to change. It's the unknown.
Yeah.
It's hard to navigate for people.
Mm-hmm. Uncomfortable, anxiety.
Suspicion.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm. There's a positive. Excitement.
Excitement. Okay. Good. That's good.
Yeah. Open.
Relief. Interesting.
Trust and hope. Those are great. Really good response. Thank you all for contributing to this. It's really no surprise that the majority of these reactions are somewhat on the more negative side, right? One of the most instinctual reactions to change is resistance, and I think we saw that visibly noted there. It is normal for employees to not want to try a new process or learn a new role. Organizational changes often mean that employees may have a new manager or new team members, or they may be asked to take on new responsibilities or roles that they're not familiar with and don't feel comfortable with. And as a result, they may want things to remain the same. It's just important for us to remember that change affects everyone in different ways, and each person responds differently and at their own pace. Some, as we kind of saw in that depiction too, they may run towards the change, right? They may roll up their sleeves, get excited, see the vision, and go for it. Whereas others may kind of sit idly by and wait to see how other people are going to react before they do anything. And yet others are going to resist, fight the change, and may ultimately end up leaving the organization because they can't get on board. Research shows that about 38% of people like to leave their comfort zone. So when these people are presented with change opportunity, they think, hey, this is great. I've got a new exciting future ahead. And they have positive interpretations of the change, which creates positive emotions. So they're happier, they're more satisfied, and they lead to greater productivity in the workplace. The other 62% of people, however, may look at that same change and immediately feel fear or discomfort or anxiety around it. They may think negative thoughts about what this potentially could do for their career development or growth, or they may think, I'm not going to like what I'm doing in my job anymore. So even though we know that change is a constant in business, that doesn't make it any easier for us to deal with. And it's important that as organizations go through changes, they recognize the various ways in which people are going to respond so that they can reassure and help them focus on the big picture that's going to result once the change is implemented.
So like Kaitlin mentioned earlier, oftentimes whenever we think about change, we think about major corporate restructurings, mergers and acquisitions, something that's really disruptive to the workplace. However, change can be something as small as a new policy or new process to do something. Anything that disrupts the way that we traditionally approach our work can warrant a need for a formalized process to change management. I think a great example of something that could warrant a change process would be your department shifting the way that they handle call-in, so a different call-in procedure. Something like that can make people feel uncertain and unsure. And I will say that regardless of what's changing, there are two best practices that I would recommend, and that's following a formalized process and ensuring that you're listening to others. So let's talk about a typical change management process. Like Kaitlin mentioned earlier, they typically follow a similar method, and I will tell you there is no shortage of opinions or ideas out there about the best way to go about change. However, today we're going to focus on Kotter's 8-step model. And really there are two overarching philosophical themes when it comes to change management. One is going to be analyze, think, and change. So that's where you present data to people to try to convince them to change. And the other one is going to be see, feel, change. And that's what Kotter's model follows. So he believes that we need to connect to the emotional side of change in order to really be effective. So as we go throughout the different steps today, really take note of how each step identifies how we're going to change and how we make people feel about change. So the first part of Kotter's 8-step model focuses on creating a climate for change. It's no surprise that change is a very dynamic process and oftentimes doesn't really follow a linear plan. And I say all that to say, as we're talking about these different processes, some of these may follow throughout the whole time. The first one around establishing urgency, that could be present throughout the whole change process. Sometimes change doesn't go the way that we think, and we've got to start over from the beginning, or we've got to do something different in order to drive effective change. Now, I will say the first step of establishing a sense of urgency is by far the thing that organizations get wrong the most. Kotter estimates that about 50% of organizations fail to create enough urgency to drive meaningful change. And I'll say, it's no surprise based on the poll that we just took, people don't want to change. They want to stay in their comfort zone. And most organizations aren't involved in a crisis. When you walk into work, you flip on your light switch, the lights come on. On payday, you look at your bank statement and you've got your direct deposit. Everything feels good, and it's hard to get people out of their comfort zone. I will say one of the things that we do sometimes as leaders is we engage in what I call happy talk, where whenever we're rolling out change, we want to highlight, oh, this is going to be really easy. It's going to be simple. It's going to be great. And we don't properly identify how challenging these steps are going to be. So what do we do about that? Well, a great best practice during this phase in the process is to bring in outsiders. How does your department handle complaints? How do you put people in front of upset vendors or patients? And that's very uncomfortable to do, but it's necessary to show people that change is needed. Sometimes as leaders, we have a tendency to want to shield people from that, and we don't want to make them uncomfortable. But we've got to do these things in order for people to see our current state and why we need to change directions. I will say another really great best practice is getting a sponsor. So, if your department is changing their call-in procedure, maybe you invite an executive within your organization to come talk to your department about why change is necessary, how this is impacting our overall organization. A lot of times when we're successful, organizations forget to look at the external market, and making sure that we're driving urgency is so critical during this whole process. So every change initiative needs a team. Identifying the right people is the first step in ensuring that you've got a good guiding coalition. During this phase, you want to make sure that you've got a diverse team. You've got to look around and answer the question, do these people have the right skills and abilities to effectively drive change? Do they represent the overall makeup of my team? Research shows that diverse teams are more likely to be innovative and more solutions oriented whenever they're going throughout the change process. Even whenever you're talking about just a department change, sometimes you need to socialize ideas before you roll them out. And maybe you find a few people that you feel like would be great and you do an offsite lunch. These types of things are what builds trust. Major organizations may host 3 or 4 day offsite meetings to talk about why change is needed and to get to know each other. However big the change initiative, you've got to select people who've got the right skills and abilities to be able to drive significant change. And then lastly, you've got to make sure that everybody understands their role and where we're going.
So to achieve lasting change, there has to be emotional buy-in from employees. And as Chelsea kind of mentioned, emotion has to be addressed as part of this to get people to really readily accept the change. We may take for granted this step a little bit because we're so eager to get to the implementation phase that we forget that we need people to connect emotionally so that when things get tough or we get to the hard parts of the implementation, people can remember the why behind it all. So a clear vision is going to help everyone understand exactly why you're asking them to do something. When people see for themselves this big picture that you're trying to achieve, the directives that you're asking them tend to make more sense. So it's said that vision is what sustains transformational change. Organizations tend to rush through this because they think that it's an easy little blip on the map, right? But when done correctly, it requires time and patience to get it right. So it's said that when creating a vision, it's an exercise of both the head and the heart, right? Because the head is needing to inspire and create kind of a big picture vision of what the end result will be. But the practical side of it needs to be well enough to understand and to create actionable items. So the process is always difficult. As Chelsea mentioned, it takes a lot of people, diverse groups of people coming together and sharing ideas, and inevitably there's going to be a little bit of debate. The group, its size, that guiding coalition is inevitably going to have different opinions that need to be kind of consolidated. And then it takes a lot of time and patience to really drive and hammer home a single vision statement. An effective process also takes into consideration that data. I think Chelsea mentioned that earlier, using company business data, market trends, forecasting, those types of things will help really build a sensible and appealing change vision and strategy. But businesses can also use narrative storytelling to really illustrate the importance of an initiative or spell out the reasoning behind critical change management initiatives. So once you've gotten a vision, you really have to test it, right? Can the vision be achieved and is it feasible? Or is this so lofty and conceptual that you're going to have a really hard time getting there? Is the vision clear and focused? Can the vision be easily articulated and communicated across a variety of stakeholder groups? So everyone from frontline to senior leadership and board members, are they all going to understand this? And in Cotter's model, he illuminates that really you should be able to communicate your vision statement in 5 minutes or less. So that's a pretty good little test there just to see if it's relatable. So to sum it up, getting to a vision that is agreed upon and shared across an entire organization, it's not an easy step. But it's certainly one that you don't want to cut any corners on, because those could have lasting ramifications as you work to roll out your process. So it's well worth putting in the time and investment now to get it right. And before we move on into really the implementation and management of the change, we want to touch on leadership through a change effort and do another poll on Mentee. So when you think of a great change leader, what qualities do they have? And it may be that as we're talking through this, you're thinking of someone in your own organization who's really been a transformational change leader. You know, what are those qualities that they possess, or what are some things that you think they need to have that maybe they don't?
I will say, Kaitlin, while we're waiting on people, one of the things that my leader does that I think is so powerful is whenever she's rolling out the change, she'll talk about it and then she'll ask me what I think. And to me, that's so profound whenever you're asking people to step outside of their comfort zones.
Yeah, that's great. So seeing communication, enthusiasm, understanding, listening, supportive.
Transparency.
That's a huge one.
Yes.
Communication, ability to listen, a lot of listening in here. Supportive.
Compassion. I think that's great. Empathy. Those are all really good skills to have when you're asking people to change.
Transparency. Sometimes you don't have all the answers, and it's okay just to admit that. This is really great. Well, I appreciate everyone kind of sharing their feedback on these. I think these are all qualities we hope leaders have anyway, but certainly in a change effort, these are even more important as you lead teams through something that potentially could be very challenging and difficult for them to understand. As we kind of go through the next phase of this process, this is really where we start to see leadership in action. And this next part is one of my particular favorites, because it's what you do with your vision after you create it that will really determine your success. So this is when we get into the implementation. How are you going to roll this out across your organization to where it has a lasting impact? So I think about this, I think if all of us could recall a time in our career where a change initiative may have been communicated either via a single email or a single meeting, I suspect the majority of us could recall that. And inevitably, I bet we would also say that that change initiative either failed completely or didn't reach its full potential because employees either didn't understand it or they were not bought in. Change has to be understood and supported in order for it to be successful. And without a great change communication strategy, the change itself is destined to fail. So when we talk about a change communication strategy as part of change management, there are several key aspects for us to consider as part of this. The first of this is to be specific early and often in your communication. So this is your opportunity to really address the who, what, where, when, how, and the why. Repetition at this stage is also really important, right? Because we know people are going to hear things differently. So it's important to repeat yourself numerous ways, which will help reinforce some of those key messages. And then it's also important to keep it simple and concise and to avoid jargon. So now is not the time to write a pages-long narrative or diatribe about all the reasons why. This is when you really just simply state exactly what you're hoping to achieve. Communicating through the right people. I think this is an area where there's huge opportunity in organizations to really get it right. Thorough change management communication requires preparing multiple employees throughout your organization to really be those advocates for change. And that includes managers and supervisors who are going to be having those one-on-one interactions with direct reports and their own teams. So best practice research confirms that employees do want to hear from leaders throughout change management. They want to hear from senior leaders who are responsible for the change about the business reasons for change, the risks, the competitive environment. But they really want to hear about the personal impacts of change and what it means to them from their immediate supervisors. I think this is where trust really comes into play as well. if employees don't trust the person who is communicating the change, they're most likely to fight it. In successful transformation efforts, leaders use all existing channels of communication to broadcast the vision as well. So we're talking about multiple forums, big, small meetings, formal and informal settings, emails, blogs, videos, presentations, you name it. It is part of the core of their communication plan. And as we talked about before, it's important to think through the reactions you're going to get when you're communicating to employees. So we know that resistance is going to be one of the most probably popular ways that people are going to respond to change. So really preparing for that emotional response is going to allow you to communicate with empathy, with compassion, and understanding to help people move through that. Listen to feedback. I think this may be the most critical part of any change management communication plan. Communication needs to flow both ways. So you may believe you've created the greatest implementation plan of all time, but if you aren't listening to the people for whom the change is going to directly affect, you've already failed. So you really have to create those spaces and those opportunities for feedback and listening. That may be more one-on-one time with your employees, however that needs to be shaped, but the two-way communication is going to be more important and more powerful than the one-way communication. And then repetition is important, which is why I'm repeating myself here. But people need to hear it over and over again, many ways about what the change is in order to really fully understand it and embrace it. And marketing has this rule of 7, which obviously I love, but it's that people need to hear your message 7 times before they take action. And this is really no different in terms of communicating something and getting people to respond to it.
Great, thanks, Kaitlin. So now we've created a compelling vision and reason for people to change. Now we've got to give them the tools to be able to be successful. So in this phase, you're looking for barriers to change. And there are a few common barriers to change. Structural change or structural barriers are very common. Skills barriers, system barriers, and then sometimes you've got leaders who are just very resistant to change. So what do we do in this process to help give people the tools that they need? The first thing that you've got to do is align responsibility with authority. We've got to help people act and act quickly. One of the things that I recommend is looking at job descriptions, making sure that the people who you're asking to change know what's expected of them and have the authority to make decisions. This will help speed up the process, and it will help ensure that more people are getting on board. The second thing that you need to do is sit down and have a calibration meeting with your team. A lot of times people they feel uncertain, and we saw that in the last slide. They don't know if they've got the skills and abilities, and more importantly, the attitudes to know what success looks like in this new model. We've got to sit down and have a good conversation about what this new model looks like, how individuals fit into this model, and give them the tools when they identify areas of opportunity. This type of conversation can be really tough, and I want to take a moment, and this is a really good piece of information. Write it down if you can. Replace defensiveness with curiosity. A lot of times when we're asking people to change, they don't want to, they don't understand. Not only as the leader, but also as the person who's being asked to change, you may find yourself getting defensive. For me, my heart may start racing, my shoulders may go up. If and when that happens, pause and reframe the situation. Instead of getting defensive, be curious, ask questions, and most importantly, be honest, because that's what's going to help continue to drive change forward. So on the next slide, we finally get to a place of celebration. So as we're developing our change model, as leaders, it's important to what we call schedule these interventions. So you want to be deliberate with making sure that you're showing people that their efforts are rewarded and that the change is successful. Cotter recommends during major change initiatives to every 3 to 6 months have some kind of intervention to show people that what they're doing is successful. Now, maybe something like your department, the call-in procedure that I mentioned earlier, maybe after a month of 100% compliance, you cater in lunch. Regardless of whatever it is, make sure that you're taking time to celebrate the wins, because that can bring resistors on board and it can show that the change is going to be successful. Now, I will say something that sometimes goes wrong here is we celebrate too much. We signal to people through celebration that the change is over and what they've done has been great. So I would be cautious that you're being very intentional and very structured with how you're celebrating your wins, because sometimes people can take their foot off the gas. So now that we've implemented the change, we need to make it stick. And this phase really talks through long-term effective change. So during the first, it's around sustaining the change. And what happens during this phase is change becomes less about an individual. And as we'll see on the next slide, it becomes more about the broader vision and long-term sustained success. A lot of modern organizations are very interconnected. And for example, something that is changing in HR could cascade down and have a domino effect on how Kaitlin does her job or how our bedside nurses do their job. During this phase, it's important leadership is very important to make sure that that vision that we created is reaching everybody within the organization. So on the next slide, we'll talk about organizational culture. And organizational culture is very complex. A lot of times leaders mistake employee engagement for culture, but really culture looks at and answers the question of how do we do things around here? Let me give you an example. So have you ever been a part of an orientation, your first day on the job, and you're learning about all these really great things that the organization does, how it reaches out to the community? Then you go on your first day in your department and you're talking about some of the things that you learned about the company, and people look at you and they're just staring. Or maybe some people are snickering in the background and you can sense that something isn't right. Over time, we adapt our behaviors to fit into that culture. Culture is complicated because a lot of times it's invisible, and a lot of times it's very subconscious, and it directs us in ways that we don't even realize. One of the things that's so important is when you're changing culture, you've got to make sure that you've got the right people. Sometimes culture change means changing people, and that's why it comes at the very end. So anytime somebody talks about the first step being changing the culture, that's almost impossible to do because it takes 7 additional steps to get where we are. However, I will say that this is the best way to ensure sustainability of change and helping people do things around. This is how we do things around here. So answering those questions and showing people that is a way that you can have sustained results. Now, change is messy, it's complicated, people don't like it, but it is so necessary whenever we are looking at being successful in the modern organization.
So to kind of summarize everything that we've talked about today, a structured process is really necessary for driving effective organizational change. The need to know how to plan, coordinate, and carry out change is crucial for businesses to ensure the successful outcomes. And certainly in today's modern post-COVID world, this is necessary. As Chelsea mentioned, change management, there are numerous models out there, and we're happy to throw those in the chat so that you can kind of look those up on your own. But we followed Cotter's model today, and regardless of the model, they really all follow 3 key phases. Each step is equally as important as the next. So initially, it's the preparation. It's how you get people ready for change. So in this phase, this is where we develop that sense of urgency that Chelsea spoke to, really highlighting why the need is necessary and now. It builds that effective coalition, your change team, if you will, who are going to really lead and shape how things are implemented throughout the entire process. And then it's that casting a vision, explaining and showing how we're going to get from here to there, and something that people can easily grasp and remember. Then we're moving into that implementation and management phase, which is also crucially important. It's what you do with your vision after you create it that will help determine your success. So a strong communication plan is necessary in order to drive that understanding and to get that employee emotional buy-in. To gain momentum around that vision, the barriers have to be removed so that people can see that it's easier to get there. And then, as Chelsea mentioned, it's celebrating those short-term wins and milestones to kind of reinforce for everyone, this is why we're doing this. This is why it's worth all the time and tears to get there. And then finally, it's looking at reinforcement. So this is the sustaining piece of the implementation of the change. And it's important to stay diligent here. You can't get to the finish line and just give up and expect things to carry on. Ensure that change is reaching all levels through that constant feedback loop. And to have a lasting impact on change, you've really got to ensure that it's embedded into the culture and into the practices within your organization. And I loved, Chelsea, your example there about this invisible culture and what people may experience in orientation and then experience once they're on the floor is a different dynamic. And so that's why it's just so important to be pervasive across the whole organization. So with that, I think that pretty much wraps up our presentation. Chelsea, is there anything else you want to add, or we can go into questions?
I don't think so. I'm excited to see what questions are out there.
Hi, ladies. We do have a couple of questions for you all. So our first question that came through is, how would we ensure that everyone is well informed about the change? Obviously, communication is super important. Our mentee showed us that. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think communication is obviously a key as part of this, and it's that feedback loop too, right? So it's, you can over communicate, make sure that that communication is getting to various different groups of people in your organization, but it's allowing that space for that one-on-one interaction to actually ask some questions to seek understanding. So you can check for understanding on both sides by saying, you know, what I heard was, or what can I clarify as part of this process? True communication really should be a conversation. So it should allow for that back and forth. And I think that will signify how informed and how much understanding employees may have as part of this change management initiative.
I think that's great, Kaitlin. And one of the things that you highlighted earlier that I think is so important is listening. I mean, whenever we saw the prompts about how change makes people feel, obviously it's very anxiety inducing, and making sure that we're connecting on an emotional level to how people are feeling will ensure that they feel heard and they understand what it takes to change and what's needed during the change process.
Thank you so much. We have another one. And you ladies did talk about really celebrating those milestones, but the question comes across as this: how do you measure success when working on a change project? So I know what I was already thinking is we don't want to celebrate too often, obviously, but what do those milestones look like then?
Yeah, I think for that question, I would kind of kick it off and say, what are people's attitudes? I mean, a lot of times, you know, we're looking at business outputs, and certainly those are very important whenever we're driving change. But what are we hearing? What are people saying about the change? Are they mostly positive? People coming around? I think those are great indicators that change is resonating with people and that you're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback on that. I think as you're setting up your change initiative, you can think through what some of those milestone kind of goals may be. So it's not that it's sprung on you at the very end and you're like, oh, we should celebrate this, but it's actually achieving some piece as part of the rollout. So set or project those key performance indicators before, you know, we get to the implementation stage, so that as you kind of hit some of those milestones, you're able to kind of celebrate those small wins at each turn.
Excellent, thank you. We have another. What happens if you fail at a certain step throughout the change management process?
Great question. And I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but you know, it's common to have some missteps. I mean, One of the things that I didn't really touch on was, you've got your guiding coalition, but what happens when turnover and people leave? Sometimes you've got to go back to the phase where the problem occurs. And I think what's really critical is understanding the root cause of what your problem is and diagnosing that correctly, and then going back to that change process and addressing it. Now, it doesn't always have to be linear. So, if we add somebody new to the team, we don't necessarily start over at that step. But I think ensuring that each step builds upon each other is very important.
And this is where, too, we heard from everyone that qualities in a leader during a change management initiative include vulnerability, transparency, honesty. I mean, these are all things, too, that when you've failed at a specific spot, or you need to kind of regroup and go back and start over, it's okay to be transparent and to communicate that to your team and to say, hey, look, we overshot here. We've got to kind of dial it back. We're going to approach it this way going forward. I think that just helps build more trust with your teams and with the people the change is going to actually impact.
We have another one I thought was really good too, is how do you respond when someone never gets on board with the changes?
Yeah, I think that can happen. And Cotter calls those people deviants. And, I think there's only so many conversations that we can have. We sit down and we hear people and we try to convince them that change is necessary. I mean, at a certain point, we've got to understand if this person fits into the vision of the organization. And if they don't, we've got to help them see what needs to change. And then it's their choice. If they choose to adopt a new way of thinking, if they're stuck in their ways, they're probably not going to be successful in the new model.
All right, let's see, let me check the time. As a leader, how do you effectively implement change if you do not support yourself? So I'm thinking they're not supporting that change themselves. They don't have buy-in? I guess so.
I think in that situation, you've got to understand what it is that you don't agree with about the change. Is it a certain aspect you not understand? You've got to have some really candid conversations with your leader to help frame the reason for change and where you're apprehensive. I mean, again, tough things to talk about, but if you don't long-term agree with the direction of the organization, you've got to understand if it's the right place for you. And like I said, we kind of shy away from talking about those things, but when you're looking at building a culture, you've got to have the right people on board.
Yeah, and if we're telling our managers and our supervisors to understand and ask those clarifying questions so that they can carry that communication to their own direct reports, we've got to have the senior leaders doing the same thing and asking those key questions. Seeking understanding and getting the buy-in there too is important. Likely they're either a part of that guiding coalition or they're closely connected to it to where they could ask some of those insightful questions. And as Chelsea mentioned, if the culture is shifting, it ultimately comes back down to whether the employee feels like they're a part of what the culture is shaping out to be.
I hear you. Thank you. That is such good feedback too. Last question. It's a trick question. All right.
Uh-oh.
In healthcare, change often comes fast. How can change management be effective in an organization so large, so fast, so often?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to follow a process. And Cotter recommends, in large scale changes, it takes about 3 to 5 years, which sometimes we don't have that kind of time. But understanding each step, and if change needs to happen really quickly, we've got to do an exceptional job of creating urgency. And I think the more effectively we can do that, the easier change can be and the quicker it can happen.
A good thought, a good takeaway I had from friends was if you're going to come into healthcare, you need to be thoughtfully nimble and be open and ready.
Yeah. Agility is going to carry you far here.
For sure. Thank you, ladies, so much. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise and insight on it. Change is hard. It is a tough conversation and tough process for many. So thank you again. We certainly appreciate it.